morning, and thank you, Svetla, for the introduction. So how many of you have a cybersecurity background here? So quite few, so I'll try to give a very high-level introduction to explain to you what we are concerned about and how it relates to the smart grid. So we start by discussing trends in IT and OT, and I explain what these things mean. We look at cyber war, because unfortunately we're looking now at cyber warfare, that the IT systems are becoming the theater of war, and this is affecting, of course, also the smart grid. We'll look a bit more at characteristics of cyber war and what we should do about this and what the challenges are. So as you heard also from here, that society is going digital. This applies to the smart grid, but to society at large. What does it mean? It means massive amount of data processing, because collection of data, communication of data, storage of data, processing of data becomes very cheap. And so we see increasingly sophisticated processing, although I would argue that in terms of smart grid, it's actually quite simple things we're doing. So the best thing, the most complex thing is machine learning to actually learn behavior. If you look what we're doing in our digital world, it's much more complex. And then it's a distributed system, also very clear, just like our computer systems. The distributed systems, what does it mean? Well, I will use a quote of Lamport. Distributed system is a system where I can't get my work done because a computer has failed that I've never heard of. And this is the same thing we will have in the smart grid. Something will break down, you don't even know it existed. It will break down and you will have no power. And of course, if your computer doesn't work or you can't work, this is annoying. If you have no power, this is a much more serious problem, in particular if it happens for a longer time and a larger scale. And so the problem is there is no border and location. In the energy system, of course, there is a location for everything, there is a border, but in the general digital systems, there are no borders and locations. So this digital revolution has, of course, enormous potential, but it also brings risks to both security and privacy. And so security and privacy people like myself and some of my colleagues, we're always paranoid and we think of what can go wrong. And you have also the optimists who say we should always do things and everything will be great. But then there are all those people that say, what can go wrong? And unfortunately, so typical reaction is, it's not going to happen to me, it's not going to happen here, it's not going to happen soon, let's not worry too much. This was more or less the attitude in 70s and 80s and even 90s. Even today you see this, but of course the numbers are getting more serious and it becomes harder to claim there's nothing to do with you. So initially you had something people called hackers, people who were bored, who were underpaid, or who just wanted to prove themselves, for whatever reasons, and they hacked into systems. You have the white hats who do it to help others and tell you about the problems. You have the black hats who do it for bad reasons. And then you have the gray hats who sometimes do illegal things, but sometimes for a good cause. Now, a modern hacker will look probably more like this. There is quite some businesses today that actually do hacking and pen testing for a fee. So in fact, it's now an open economy where you can hire white hackers or red teams to look at your systems. As soon as money got involved, so the digital world, we got money as soon as there was commerce. So if we go back to mid-90s, the web came about, you would start buying stuff online and suddenly money was involved. And where money is, there will always be organized crime. So they followed the money and they, rather than robbing a bank, you actually try to steal credit card numbers or go after e-commerce or digital systems. We also saw, of course, as more value was put in those systems, you got insider fraud, people who were for some reason unhappy. They actually were attacking the systems from inside. And then nation states got involved. So in fact, IT systems are so important that it's impossible for a nation state not to be involved. And that can be, as we will see, at many levels. Can be initially spying, can be hacking, and also plain open warfare. Of course, as nation states do this, you will see less and less what's happening, because nation states don't want to be caught. You also got hacktivism in the late 90s, where organizations that, for example, wanted to support particular goals, or WikiLeaks, they actually started hacking systems. You see the same now in Ukraine, that Ukraine and Russia asked volunteers to help them to hack the other country and damage systems. As I mentioned, the ultimate target will be cyber war. There will be war in cyberspace. And if our grid systems are digital, they will be part of the war front. That's more or less the future. Is it depressing? Yes, it is. But I'm afraid I can't change it. This is reality. We can't deny this. We can't put the head in the sand and claim it's not going to happen. This is going to happen. I guess you all have heard of ransomware. Anybody has not heard of ransomware? Okay, so we have malware. The idea of a virus dates back to the 70s. The first bigger viruses were in the 80s and 90s. But we got cryptocurrencies about 10, 12 years ago. And together with cryptography and malware, that made a perfect combination. Because what can you do? You just have malware that penetrates the system. You then use cryptography to encrypt everything in the system. And then you ask for money to decrypt it again. And you have to pay by cryptocurrencies, so it goes anonymously, or at least well protected, over the internet. So suddenly you have a business model, what to do with hacking. And this is being used by organized crime at large scale, but of course also by nation states. So North Korea is known to also have ransomware campaigns to get more money, because you know that there is certain blockage on their economy, there is a boycott, an embargo, and so they actually use ransomware to collect cryptocurrencies and to collect money. And of course, as we will see also, Russia used the other thing. You can also encrypt files and throw away the key, right? And then whatever happens, you mimic it at ransomware, but in fact the data will never come back, because unfortunately cryptographers like myself, we do a very good job, and once we throw away the key, it's lost forever. You never get your data back. So this is getting serious. It's hard to get good numbers, and you should always be suspicious. But last year the numbers are about $600 million paid to these ransomware guys. For this year, the estimate is $1 billion that will be paid. It's still peanuts, right? I mean, the gaming industry is $150 billion. The cybersecurity industry is similar size, $150 billion. So it's very small at economic scale. Credit card fraud is $12 to $15 billion. But of course, the damage is bigger than what you pay, because you also lose your systems. You're out of business, or at least you cannot operate. You have to restore your systems. So the estimate is that the losses this year will be about $20 billion to ransomware. So even if you pay, you will get the key, but the key may not work, or the software may not work to decrypt the data. And the latest ploy is that before encrypting your data, they steal your data, and then they come back a month later and they say, if you don't pay us again, then we'll actually leak all your data. And so this is more or less the reality. There is now an economic model for crime that's also being used by nation states, and it's also affecting critical infrastructure. Because of course they know that critical infrastructure will pay up. They cannot say, oh, we'll shut down our business for a few weeks and we start from scratch. If you're running a hospital or a big plant, as you see, an energy sector only got 31 attacks, only 31. It's still much less than the hospitals. But so there were about 600 attacks affecting critical infrastructure. So this is the new scene. And so the point is not to saying nobody's interested in my data. Who cares about my system? I'm only a small player. I will not be visible. These people have found a business model to go after everybody who can pay them something. So there's clearly a technology dimension to this. We should make our systems more secure so that those kind of attacks are not happening. Technology is important, but of course there is also regulation needed, and you'll hear more about that. We have to have good governance. We have to look at ethics. What is your ethical? For example, if you find a flaw, what should you do? Who should you contact? Should you make it public? Should you talk to the vendor? What if the vendor doesn't answer? What if you suddenly get a call to say, somebody, I'm going to give you $1 million if you tell it to me and not to the vendor? So you immediately enter in the realm of ethics. And there is also economics there and psychology, and I think we underestimated this a lot. I'll give you a few examples of economics in cybersecurity later on. Technical point of view, of course, you have to look at cryptography to protect your data, at software and hardware security, at privacy aspects, at system and infrastructure. So there is many dimensions to look at. It's not something where there is a silver bullet. It's a societal problem comparable to the crime problem in general. It's not just one technology that will stop crime. Right? In our society, we need knives, and it turns out that some people actually kill others with knives. You cannot just ban knives. The same thing with digital technology. You have it, and so it will be abused. And you have to look at all kinds of aspects to make technology more secure, but you have to accept that you'll never be 100% secure, that you can't prevent all attacks. We also see a shift from prevention, which was the mindset in 70s, 80s, and 90s. The mind has now shifted to more detection and response. So in some settings, we'll explain you why industry has given up on to try to prevent attacks, and we just try to detect and respond faster. So what do we have as trends in the industry? Of course, we have the Internet of Things. This means that every object will get a computer. It will be every object in our house, but also our vehicles and even our cities. We've just surpassed the threshold of having more IoT computers than computers in our households. So I think the total is now slightly above 20 billion, and it was about 8 to 9 billion computers we sit in front of, or tablets, and about 11 or 12 billion IoT devices. And this will grow further to something like 40 billion in the next decade. So we'll have 50 billion devices, which were announced for 2020 in 2030. The IoT is also intrusive because it sits everywhere. It's unavoidable. As a good example, smart meters will be mandatory at some stage. You can't avoid it anymore. You'll be forced to have this thing in your house unless you don't want power. But that's a very radical decision. And the systems are stealthy, which means you may not see them. Right? That's, I think, also technology is shrinking. We put computers in all our cities. We have lots of sensors in trash cans, in all kinds of roads, in buildings, and you can't avoid these things. You can't see them anymore. It becomes very different from computers we used to manipulate. It's computers which are everywhere, which you can't avoid, and which are not visible. So there is many definitions of IoT. I will not go too much in detail here, but so some people even look at things like smart dust, where they would use this for agriculture, where they would spread this dust and do measurements of humidity, of temperature conditions, of soil conditions, and so on, to much more complex ecosystems like smart cities. And of course, every city wants to be smart. Who wants to be a dumb city, right? You want to be a smart city, which means you put sensors everywhere, and which also means that as soon as you go there as a visitor, you will be monitored the whole time. And so some people have read or understood part of GDPR, and I'm quite sure Eleni will talk about this. And one of the principles is you can process data based on consent, and I guess then, or because it's needed. So I guess the city will argue that if you enter the city, then you consent to being monitored all the time, or we need to operate our city like this, and this is why we have to do this. And if you don't want to play in a smart city, well, then stay in the countryside. That's more or less the message you got today. IoT systems are not very secure, and it's not because we don't have technology. So I think there is quite some very good security technology, but it's not clear who is responsible. Who's responsible for which component, and what are the effects? A good example is the Mirai botnet. I don't know whether you heard of this, but 2016, some hackers found a flaw in a whole range of webcams. These webcams had a default password. What did they do? They actually hacked these webcams. They made them into a big botnet of 100,000 of machines, and they went after a security journalist they didn't like because he wrote about cybercrime. And so they more or less brought down his website with something like 600 gigabit per second data flows, all coming from all these webcams. Okay? So can you blame the user? The user just went to the shop and bought a 20-euro webcam, and he put it there to watch his coffee machine or the door where his cat enters or whatever. Like, that's all what they wanted to do, was to look where the cat was. Okay? You can't expect that users start configuring these devices and put a firewall and review the code and so on. These webcams were not updatable. So the password was known and fixed and was not changeable. So after this attack, the only responsible thing to do was put it in the trash. Of course, nobody did that. They just kept their webcam. Why? Because it was not their problem. Okay, these scams went after a journalist in the US. Why should I care about this? 2 weeks later, the same webcams went after the internet service in the US. And so the East Coast lost internet services like Twitter and Facebook and so on for several hours. But again, who's to blame? It's very unclear. It's a market for lemons. And the lemon is not this fruit, but the lemon is a used car. So if you move to the US, then like I did as a postdoc, you don't have money. So you go to this place and you have to buy a car there, and there is shiny cars, but you know for sure what's going to happen is you'll buy a car, it costs $2,000, and you'll drive around, and of course it probably was in an accident, probably they tampered with the odometer. So you drive around the corner and maybe something will fall off, and then a week later you go on the freeway and then your engine will blow up. That's what's called a lemon in the US. It's like a used car that's a disaster, but it's very shiny. So now I know that this is a lemon, so I'm not going to pay $5,000 because I know that I will be there back in a month to buy a new car. So I'm going to give a very low amount for this car because I take a high risk. And so that means that actually, why is this? Because I can't tell the good cars from the bad cars. If I was an expert, I could choose a good car. I would happily pay $3,000 or $4,000. But as a non-expert, I can only look at, I like the red one, or I think these wheels are nicer, and then hope for the best. And so the same happens in actually all our IT devices. The average user cannot tell which ones are secure and which are insecure. So you go to the shop and you see 10 webcams. Which one is more secure? You have no idea, so you'll pick the one in the nicest color or the one with the highest resolution. So in fact, you will not pay more, even if it would say more secure. Why would you do this? First, it's not your problem. And second, why should you believe that? Okay, so you want to buy the cheapest one. And the vendors know this too. So as vendor, if you build secure webcams and your product is twice as expensive, you will not sell, you'll go out of business. Okay, so the market here fails because it's a race to the bottom. So we know we need regulation. So the government has to come in and secure webcams. Now, the government has done this, for example, by mandating seatbelts in cars. Right? They said you can't sell a car without seatbelts anymore. And so now the government is coming in and mandating secure IoT devices. The problem is just that cybersecurity is way more complex than a seatbelt. So you cannot just build it as easily or have it as easily. I like to show these numbers. They're a bit outdated, but I think they're still very useful because they come from Gartner, and Gartner is very important. I know that university people don't know this, but Gartner is important because the CEO believes Gartner. And this is why Gartner is always important, because the CEO pays a lot of money to read the reports of Gartner. And so Gartner wrote 6 years ago that the IoT market will be $3 trillion per year by 2020. Probably never went there, but the CEO believed that, remember? So the CEO believed that the market would be $3,000 billion. What is more shocking is that Gartner believed that the IoT security market would be $500 million. Okay, 3 trillion, $500 million. What matters is not the absolute numbers, but the ratio. So Gartner promised you there would be about 10 billion devices for about €300 each, so it was high-end IoT devices, I would say. But the security budget for these devices was half a cent. That's what Gartner believes. There is no money for security. And then later on, they revised their numbers. They say we made a mistake. In fact, it will be about 1.5 billion or 3 billion. Sounds a lot of money, but in fact, it's now 3 cents per device. You can't secure a device for 3 cents. And this is, of course, general IoT, but this also applies to smart meters and every component in the electricity world. The rule of thumb is you should invest 15% in cybersecurity of your IT costs. Most companies invest much less. And why? Because it's not their problem. Okay? Because if something bad happens, it usually happens to somebody else. Even if they want to spend the money, they don't know on what. There is no shop where you can see secure meters, insecure meters. They all look the same. And the other thing is that it's a problem for later, or you hope it doesn't happen to you. Okay, so this is why these investments are too low. So I think in 20 years from now, we'll look back at 2022 like we look today at this car. It's a beautiful car. We wouldn't paint our houses pink necessarily, but if somebody would give me such a car, I would be very happy. It looks really good. But if you look inside, there is no seat belts. There is no ABS. There is no anti-slip control. And if you get involved in an accident, there will be a metal pin coming from the steering wheel and you'll be fixed in your seat forever. And I think this is how our current IT systems look. They will look at those in 20 years and say, how could we do this? How could we build systems like this? But the same thing as we look now at the 60s and say, how could people build cars like this? Were they not, so what? But of course, the difference is that The only impact here is that if you bought such a car, got in an accident, tough, the numbers were bad. Of course, today in our IT systems, it may affect society at large at a much larger scale because we depend now on those systems much more. What about OT? OT stands for operational technology. Some people call this part of IoT, some say it's different. So this is more or less the industry 4.0, the factories, and I guess the energy systems are part of this. So they're not like normal IT, like finance and file servers. They're more like sensors, safety instruments, PLCs, and RTU, control systems, operation systems. So they're much lower. And I can tell you a secret, there is even much less money for this. Here there is still some money, but I have several friends working in the industry, and they go to these companies and say, you should invest here, and there is money here, but there is no money there. That's the reality. There is just no money to look at the OT systems. There is many confusing terminologies. I'm not going to try to sort this out, but so some people call the overall thing operational technologies. There is industrial control systems are part of this. SCADA is supervising control and data acquisition is a subset of this, and you have devices like PLC or process control systems with kind of sometimes ICS, sometimes SCADA. So it's just, you can write your paper 5 times with different terms. It's more or less related things, but you see this, that people confuse these things or rename things. But it's about the devices I showed you on the previous slide. So they're not about your servers with databases, analytics, and transactions. They're about machinery, control, and equipment. Of course, this is much more expensive. That doesn't mean they will spend much more on security. These machines are real-time. They're decentralized, although they're all hooked up the network. If you go to somebody and says, my systems are air-gapped, which means there is no connection to the internet, then you know that they're lying, or they don't know their system. Because it's clear that no technician today wants to get a message on Saturday at 10 p.m. when he's watching a movie of a problem in a system, and then have to take his car and her car and drive to the factory and fix something. Today, even if you forbid them, they'll somehow make an SSH connection somewhere and they'll fix it from their homes. And as a manager, you probably don't even know this is happening. So if you believe your systems are air-gapped, then you just don't know about your systems. So they're actually connected. They have much longer life cycle. A PC you throw out after 3 or 5 years. Those systems can be there for 30 to 50 years. And so there is no service or security management. You cannot centralize do this. This is all much more ad hoc. So if something goes wrong, okay, then what you do is, in the IT world, if you see that ransomware is active, then you stop everything and you try to secure your data. In the industrial world, you try to save the process because you don't want your plant to blow up, okay? You don't care about the data, but you care about your plant because that costs $1 billion. You try to isolate the problem, so you try to really physically separate machines. And you try to keep continuing because this plant costs so many euros per hour that, you know, even if one part falls out, you want to keep the rest moving because your staff is there, your materials are there, you have to keep moving. So a very different way of approaching this. Integrity before availability, before confidentiality, while in very often the classical world is confidentiality before integrity, before availability. A good example, if you want to get the illustration, many companies have a policy you should have screensavers on everything. Right? If you have screensavers in such a system, you'll be in big trouble. Then the guy walks around the whole time touching all the screens because they're on screensaver. It doesn't work. Something about the energy system. I will not go into detail, but I want to give you an idea of the complexity. This is from a NIST standard from about 12 years ago. They tried to inventorize what happened. And my guess is if you look today, it's probably even more complex. But so you have, of course, bulk generation, and you have customers, you have transmission distribution. They all are connected in operation because they do have to talk to each other. Right? They all have to know what to do. There is now service providers on top that sell you services. In the future, they may sell you services to manage your devices or to manage your car battery and all these kind of things. So it's a very complex ecosystem. And they're all connected. It's not that you can draw clear lines. They're all connected to each other. Okay, so this is an attempt from a few years ago to map this to the Belgian situation. So you have Elia for transmission, you have a bulk generation, you have Fluvius for the distribution, you have service providers like EnergyBox, and then you still have marketing like APX. So it's an enormously complex ecosystem. Okay, so As a security person, when I see this, I'm very scared because it's a very complex system. There is a lot of vested interest. Nobody wants to change this, but they're kind of forced by the energy revolution. And I know kind of for sure they will not invest enough in security. And even if they would invest enough, it would be very hard to make this secure because it's so complex. So it has to be dependable, right? You don't want your power to go down. It's real time. If there is a fault somewhere, you have to respond immediately. You can't afford to wait. There is no money. That's the essence. Of course, there is money because you can see it on your bill. There is some money, a lot of money even. But there is no money for the OT. Those people will not get the money. Long life components. So failure can mean people die even. Of course, systems get damaged. And the scale is enormous. So in Europe, they expect 350 million meters. The plan is now 225 in 2 years from now. Interesting enough, in 2013, when they finished the standards, they said they would deploy this in 7 years, which that's what they promise now, so you should never believe this. This is not like an iPhone or like an iPad or something like this, which you can get into the market in the billions in a few years' time. Here, somebody has to go to every home, and then people object against it. In the Netherlands, for example, they put smart meters without the legal framework, and then actually people insisted the meters be ripped out again. That doesn't go very fast. If you put millions of smart meters and you have to put some back out and put the old ones in, and then come 10 years later back to put smart one in, that doesn't go very fast. So my expectation is probably more like 14 to 17 years before they'll be done. So at this moment, apparently, so the forecast is that they will have something like 70 or 80% done in 2 years from now. So as I showed you, it's very complex. It's a very complex ecosystem, which you just not come in with a team of 2 people and say, oh, we're going to solve this problem here. This is a very complex ecosystem with many players. We actually don't fully understand the use cases and the threats. One of my friends, Klaus Kosabe, was a postdoc in Kosik, and he was invited to the US to work on the threat analysis of the smart grid. And after they were done, the document was classified, so you couldn't see it anymore. Because the US government realized it was so sensitive that like some person from Europe should not see this, how weak the grid was. I think also more than 20 years ago, I talked to Professor Belmas, my colleague, and I said, there is a problem because you go digital. He said, I don't talk about this. That was the attitude 20 years ago. I don't talk about it. Up to you, I don't talk about these things. Because the idea was, if we don't talk about it, head in the sand, then we don't have a problem. Not because they didn't want to solve it, but they knew there was no budget, so it's better to hope nothing goes wrong. Also high problem with availability of people and maturity. So there is just, even if you want to do the right thing, it's not that you can go on the market and buy all the secure equipment, because the vendors have not invested enough. Why? Because the users don't invest enough. And so it's kind of a vicious circle that has to be solved by regulation. There is also privacy. In fact, I'm not going to talk too much about privacy. I do think there is a serious problem. I hope that Eleni will speak more about it. Of course, if you see electricity consumption, you can learn a lot about somebody. And it's also a bit different from normal things. If I don't want to have a Facebook account, or I don't want to have a smartphone, I don't have one, with a smart meter will be forced upon you. And this, of course, puts a responsibility in society to do something about this. On the other hand, you can see whether somebody is at home. You can see whether somebody is watching TV late. You can see whether somebody is making too many ready meals. You can actually see whether somebody moved in there, and you can even see religion. You can see all these patterns in the power consumption, especially if you have a high resolution. It's highly sensitive, and everybody wants the data to make predictions. And what they don't tell you, to detect fraud as well. That's another reason why you want this. But in fact, this data is highly sensitive. And the only solution I am aware of is aggregation. If you aggregate many households, and over time, if you don't give it by the minute or give it by the hour, it becomes much less sensitive. So we had IT and OT. The third trend is big data. So we have much more data. This is, again, a Gartner slide from 12 years ago. So 12 years ago, Gartner believed in big data, and I guess they were right. Big data has happened. Enormously amounts of data come at very high speed and very high variety. And this is being used to drive the digital economy, to make money. The message from the Commission was data is the new oil. I think it was a very good image because data is like oil, as we will see. So today, big data means you use the cloud. All of you have switched on their smartphones and enabled cloud services because it's so nice. You can share your pictures, and if your phone dies, you buy a new phone, you log in, and voila, everything is there again. Why would you deal with backups and all these things yourself? The cloud is fantastic, and it's free. The cloud is someone else's computer. That's, I think, the definition of the cloud. So we've decided, 12 years ago, that it was too expensive to run our own computers. We now put our data in other people's computers because it's cheaper, it's economics, and it's more flexible. There is some legal debates about this because in Europe we have a strict legal protection of data, and most of our cloud data goes to the US, as we know. But Europe has solved this problem by saying that the US is okay. And that's called safe harbor. But then Snowden leaked some documents, and Max Schrems went to court, and then the highest European court said, no, the US is not okay. They spy on everybody all the time, and you have no legal recourse. Then the Commission comes in, and they create a privacy shield, which says, don't worry, the US is okay. So Max Schrems went to court again, and what the European court said was, the US is not okay. That's called Schrems 2. And so 2 weeks ago, Biden signed a statement saying, we are okay, trust us. And Europe says, yes, you're okay. And Max Schrems has said, I'm going to the court again. So in 2025, the European court will say, the US is not okay. As an engineer, I have a very big problem not getting cynical about this. Because it's about our fundamental rights, and just the courts are playing a carousel game. That's what they're doing. Because in the end, the US have our data now for 15 years, and they will have it for the next 15 years as well. Services are free, but we pay with our data. And it's not only Facebook and Google, it's hundreds of companies, and this is a slide from a while ago, so probably there now is hundreds of new companies are actually trading your data the whole time. And this is to link between advertisers, these people who want to sell you new cars or new perfume or whatever, and publishers, which is like newspapers or content providers. And so, as a user, good luck to try to find out what these companies do. And so in the smart grid ecosystem, if I listen carefully, they want to create the same thing. Data providers, data analyzers, but you never find out who they are and where they work, and by the time you find out they've been bought by somebody else and they've been created, this is the dynamic economy. But for privacy, it's a concern. This is used to observers all the time, and IoT, of course, has a very big brother effect. We now have technology to detect people, to identify people. So it's a very big change in society now of technologists. We've always been encouraged to do everything we can, but we are getting our Hiroshima moment now. So, you know, in 1945, the Americans threw nuclear bombs, and the guys in physics became very concerned that they've been doing science, and some of this science is being used to destroy humanity. And now the IT people are saying, hey, we're actually now building mass surveillance systems where we can recognize every face in the street. And of course, there will be many business cases for this. And the police will love it, and somebody else. But now, as IT people, we should say, we shouldn't do this. It's not because you can build something, you should do this. That's actually where IT is going. We have to now stop doing this. Face recognition is one thing. The next step is emotion recognition. So your boss knows whether you came in happy or not, and whether you had a fresh spirit or whether you looked a bit tired and must have partied a lot yesterday night. So, in cybersecurity, big data is very important because, you know, if you go to the trade shows, this is starting to happen about 10 years ago, they say your systems are getting very complex. So if you have no visibility, if you don't know which devices are in your network, how can you be secure? So you have to watch all the devices in your network. And I think until 10 years ago, this was fine because they were the company devices. Today, people bring their own devices, their own phones, their own tablets, with also their personal data, and they actually also hook it up to the company network. So in fact, if you work for a US company, you get some special spy software to look at everything you do on your device. So my advice is, if you work for such a company, get 2 phones. But okay, so the second thing is that industry has understood is securing things is too expensive. It's too complex, it changes too much. Of course, they still try, but they're going to invest a large part of effort to detect stuff rather than making it secure. Rather than trying to build secure systems, we'll try to detect problems. Okay, that's much cheaper. And then you have these people building these SOCs. So you see these huge rooms with screens, and then you have lots of people sitting in front. And to be very honest, those people are now sitting there in Eastern Europe or in Asia because we have too high salaries in Western Europe. And of course, now they found a better solution. Rather than having people sitting there, let computers sit there. So you have now AI detecting what's happening, analyzing everything. And this is where we're going, that we have AI systems monitoring everything all the time and detecting what is good and what is bad. Rather than building secure systems, we build something that's unsecurable and then put a big brother in charge with AI. It sounds scary to me because AI can fail and AI is not accountable. And in Europe, we try to control this with legislation, but I'm afraid it will be a bit like GDPR, which means very nice legislation and very weak enforcement. What people forget about big data means bigger breaches. So it's kind of as academic, I keep being baffled by the fact that we're allowed to collect more and more data, yet we lose more and more of it. So if you're bored, you should really go to this website. Information is beautiful, and look at the biggest data breaches. The website goes back to 2015, so I only show you part of it. What I find baffling is the scale of this. So if you add up all the people in there, we already have every person on the internet has their data breached already 5 times, at least. So all these companies, they actually collect our data, but they seem to be unable to protect it. I mean, the worst case for them, they get a fine, which is 4% of global turnover. It's a lot of money, but it's 4%. So it's also government systems, it's military systems are there as well. So it's not only, it's also data that affects the security of society. So it only, of course, you can feel sorry that your data has been breached. Maybe you have to get a new credit card. But for example, in the US, they lost all the personal data of people in security clearance. What is personal data? Place of birth, where they studied, alcohol problems, medical problems, relationships problems. Everything they ask you in an interview for clearance, this database was lost probably to China. That's not only a privacy problem, that's also a security problem for your country. So I think what we've seen in general is that we've been told, and this happened after 9/11, and I think in Europe after the attacks in Madrid, London, Paris, and Brussels, more or less, it's clear that if you listen to politicians, they still speak a lot of privacy, but in practice, they actually go for security. And I think data is indeed the new oil in the sense that, of course, in the 50s and 60s, we had, or even before, but there was really the boom of the industry based on oil and gas. And in fact, we also got pollution. And I think big data is pollution because it's something that affects society, and it's like pollution, it affects your neighbor. If you leak data, it affects other people. A good example of this is the Gaydar app on Facebook. So there was an app on Facebook, 2008, and that said for every Facebook user the percentage they were gay. Depending on their friends, the books they read, the bars they visit, the music they like, they gave everybody a percentage. So they were outing people without their permission. Now you can say, oh, I'm gay, I'm going to out it, that's fine. But in fact, by doing that, you affect other people. And the whole ecosystem is more like pollution, where everybody suffers from what individuals do. So I think in 20 years from now, we'll look at the time now and say, how could we do this? How could we build these systems where all this data was flowing and we said big data is great? We actually ruined our society. Then there's the government. So 2013, Snowden leaked these documents. One of the more nice things about this is that I can borrow slides from the NSA. I don't have to make my own slides. And the slides from the NSA say, who knew in 1984 that this would be Big Brother and the zombies would be paying customers? These are slides from the NSA. So the NSA calls iPhone users public zombies who pay for their own surveillance. Any iPhone users here? So few. Of course, Android is the same. You also pay for your own surveillance. There's no difference. Just the slide of the NSA was about the iPhone. There's also metadata, but I'll skip that for now. So in society, you have these three powers. You have, on the one hand, users, you have industry, and you have government. And in Europe, we tend to trust our governments and distrust industry. In the US, it's the other way around. They actually trust industry much more than government. But industry has changed. So industry now has big data, has Internet of Things, and has this, what Jana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, a business model where actually money is being made through advertising based on surveillance. So industry has much more data. And what do we know from Snowden is that there is something called the PRISM program in which the government has access to all this data. We still don't know whether it's real time and what scale, but Snowden says it was real time. He could look in everybody's account, everybody's social media account, while he was working for a contractor of the NSA. So this now has changed the power balance because we have privacy legislation to control industry and government, but in particular to control industry in Europe. But so by having this PRISM program, in fact, the more data industry has, the more data government has. And so in fact, the government has no incentive to limit industry because they actually now work together. And you can argue that, of course, our governments in Europe don't have access to the Google and Facebook and Apple data. It's only the NSA. But then you should look at the Snowden documents, and our governments work together with NSA and GCHQ. As an example, and this was testified in German parliament, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the German spy service, was spying on German companies. I'm not making this up, I'm not misspeaking. The Secret Service of Germany was spying on German companies and giving this data to the British in exchange for information of the systems of the NSA and GCHQ. Because NSA and GCHQ, they build like Google-like systems in which they can spy on everybody. And so if you believe that your own government in Europe doesn't do this, I think you're naive. So that's more or less where we are today. So this is just spying. It's kind of hard to escape. You have to throw away all your devices or build your own systems. But so in some sense it's getting worse because now this is where warfare will be held. So already in '72, the Department of Defense warned about security problems, and they published the Orange Book, which is actually how to evaluate computers. I think it was, in retrospect, a major failure because the idea was to build trusted computer systems. And I think in the whole history, only one trusted computer system was built at the highest level. It was unusable. And today, your computer systems are not evaluated according to those standards. So then science fiction writers started worrying about cyber wars and robots. I'll go very fast here. Then somebody wrote about electronic Pearl Harbor. This is '91. And then RAND, which is a defense think tank, worried about, again, attacks on military systems. In '96, they worried about attacks on critical infrastructure. So I'm going very fast here, but you'll get the slides. And then we saw the first war. I'm skipping here also some things. I'm giving a few highlights. Estonia actually decided to move some statues of Russian heroes, and then the Russians actually attacked the Estonian e-government systems. And Estonia is the most advanced country in terms of e-government, so they actually suffered if their government services were down. Then we got the first hybrid war. So when Russia invaded Georgia, at the same time they were also doing cyber attacks. Now it didn't impact so much of Georgia because I think only 7% of people had internet access. So it was not such a big deal, but it still happened. I'm skipping slides about China going after Google systems, China going after GitHub. But I think 2012, we had Panetta speaking about, again, cyber Pearl Harbor. So the US became aware that this is really a big problem. And they actually decided to add cyber capabilities to their defense. So the Cyber Command was created 12 years ago under the direction of the NSA. And then they were elevated to unified combatant. And so more or less what you now have is you have the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, you have the Space Division, and you have the Cyber Division. And now all the other armies are following this model as well. So all the military systems now have a cyber component. And so NATO followed, as you see, about 8 years later. And this is not only about defending your systems, it's also about attacking systems. So this is the first, as military call it, kinetic cyber attack, in the sense that systems were really damaged. It's still more like sabotage, it's not really war in this case. So Israel and the US, they put malware on the air-gapped centrifuges in Iran. So they were used to enrich uranium. It was a very sophisticated attack. The virus leaked then later, so I have it on one of my machines. Stuxnet, a very sophisticated virus. And so it damaged about 25% of the centrifuges by making them spin too hard. So the Israelis made the virus too aggressive, so it escaped beyond the plant, and this is how it was discovered later. So Iran, of course, struck back. They attacked with malware the oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, they attacked US banks, and they attacked a casino in the US. So this is all the response following 2010. So as I mentioned, China and North Korea are the other big players. And of course now the European countries are following as well. Even Belgium now has a cyber attack team. I tell them, if you live in a glass house, you shouldn't throw stones at people, but I don't know whether they listen to me. You know that the Belgians got a cyber attack on the military last December, and they were for 6 weeks out of email, right? 6 weeks out of email. I guess they're not allowed to use Gmail, but it tells you something that... Anyway, so it's now a very hot topic, of course, but the Ukraine war, so the Russians actually went after the Ukrainian systems 7 years ago. They put 250,000 people without power, using a spear phishing attack, so sending a specific email, then going after the SCADA systems, using kill disk to wipe data, and a DDoS attack on the call center so people couldn't call and find out what was happening. That was quite a big attack. Then they attacked the government system the year after, and then in December the year after, they actually went after ICS substations. So because of those, NATO trained Ukraine a lot, and Ukraine is actually at this moment probably the best defended country in Western Europe, apart maybe from UK, France and Germany. They've invested a lot as a consequence of those attacks. 2017, there was this NotPetya. As I mentioned, this is a disk wiper. It masquerades as ransomware, but in fact, it throws away the key, so you never get your data back. NotPetya is another interesting example because there is quite a history behind it. So the NSA found a flaw in some Windows systems. We don't know when, but it was a serious flaw that probably existed from the early 90s in the SMB system. And the NSA decided never to tell Microsoft. Although the whole world uses Windows, the NSA decided to shut up. Then the next thing happened is the NSA was hacked by somebody, probably the Russians, and the Russians found this flaw. And apparently also North Korea got their hands on it. And so this gave rise to WannaCry, Petya and NotPetya. They're kind of a series of attacks. They have some connections. But especially NotPetya was quite big because it escaped Ukraine. Maersk claimed 250 million damage. So they could not use any computer anymore. Like one of the largest shipping companies in the world had to do all the things based on paper again. And the FBI claims the total cost was $10 billion. And just all because the NSA had a flaw they never told Microsoft. Then they lost this flaw. Then this was used by the Russians against the Ukrainian tax software, and then it escaped from Ukraine by accident and hit the rest of the world. So, you know, in the 90s, we were warning people, do something about this, be worried about this, and everybody was laughing. I think now people still see it serious, although you still see in the industry, this is not going to happen to me attitude, right? This kind of, the big companies, they go after Google or Maersk, but it's not going to happen to me. There was the attack on the Democrats using sophisticated malware. I'll skip that, the details. I think a very important attack was happening 2 years ago called SolarWinds. So why is it so important? Because they discovered a much better way to attack systems. You can go after Microsoft or you can go after a company like SolarWinds. They actually manage the networks of all the large ministries and companies. It's called supply chain attack. So you actually go into the companies that are not so sophisticated, but that do manage systems for large providers. So they have software to do this, and they made a fake software update for those systems. And so the Russians waited a bit, and soon So it was discovered November 2020. All the US government agencies, but also European Parliament, Microsoft, Cisco, probably NATO, they all realized that the Russians could breach their systems completely. And the only way to get rid of this thing is to start your systems from scratch again. Because once somebody gets in, you don't know what they did. So you have to throw out all your computers, wipe everything, and build everything from scratch again. So this is a very big success where in the West, we don't like to make too much noise about it, but it shows that this is actually happening and having enormous impact. And then, of course, this year, the Russians started with DDoS on the Ukrainian government in January. They tried 6 Viper malware strains, so this is this ransomware that wipes data. They got away quite well with it. And then there was an attack on the satellite modems that had some effect. It's still, apparently still some of those things are out of service, and they're also used to control wind turbines. So again, this is collateral damage. Maybe Putin is not unhappy that it happened because he wants to go after our energy systems, but this was not the target, but it happened. Okay, and of course, there is many things we will only find out in a year from now, or after the war is over. I also mentioned hacktivist, and of course, again, this was not a cyber attack, but a physical attack on Nord Stream. So it's clear that the energy systems are a target. I was very amused to read that today Belgium announces that they will improve the security of their energy systems because of the attacks on Nord Stream. What were they doing in the last 8 months? If a war is starting, if you have been reading the press about what's happening in Ukraine in 2015, and then you have to wait 8 months to see, oh, this pipeline is blowing up. Maybe we should do something about our cybersecurity. It's a bit depressing, I would say. Okay, so cyber war is very different because first, in traditional war, and I'm not a military expert at all, but it's very clear who is military and not military. And there is a legal regime about this, and somebody wearing a uniform or somebody who is civilian combatant, they're a legitimate target. It's very clear, military, non-military. Okay? Now, in cyber war, it becomes much more blurry because what you see is that China and Russia, but also the Americans, they create kind of these organizations which are loosely connected to the government and that work for them. But if something goes wrong, then they say, oh, we don't know them. Right? It's more like spies, actually. But they're actually large organizations that are doing hacking services, that are launching attacks. And so the next step is smaller countries. So Germany is aiming for a cyber army of, I think, 10,000, 12,000 people. So they've created a new university in Munich, the Bundeswehr University, the new cybersecurity unit there with 12 professors, and they want to train in total 10,000 people. Okay, so the same orders of magnitude you can expect US probably even more. So this is 10,000 of people in this cyber warfare. But what do you do if you're Italy or Belgium? Well, even if you invest in this, at best you can have a few hundred people, maybe a few dozen if you're lucky. So what they will do is they'll actually work with companies. So there is companies like NSO Group, like Celebrite, like Hacking Team, that will serve the hacking services to governments. In Emirates you have Dark Matter. Hacking Team is very interesting because Hacking Team was hacked. And so 47 gigabytes of everything they did, their tools, their customers, and their email, everything is on the internet. If you're bored, you should really read it. It's very interesting reading. So, and you see, of course, that they sell tools to police forces, but also to governments. And it's also very clear that they don't care whether the government is democratic or not. That's not the criterion. Business is business. And so it's quite complex now that there is this whole range of organizations from military to, we see a bit more of this, clearly government side, to kind of deniable, so fake companies, and then the real companies, and they're all in this business. And it's an amazing business. If you find today a flaw in an iPhone, a 0-day in iOS, you get $1 to $2 million from Apple. How much do you think these companies pay you? So probably a multiple of that. So this is, of course, only for the elite to try to do this, but this is clearly a very big business. So, of course, the question is now, what about the individual? So you now have to start putting these trade-offs. What about your individual security and privacy? You know, if you see this kind of context, can you still say, oh, but my meter leaks some data about when I get up at night? Yeah, well, the military will say, look, guy, you want to be hacked by Russia and lose your power for 2 weeks and you have no food anymore, or you give up. So I think this game of giving up privacy for security is now playing at a different level. It's no longer like, do you want these convenience services? The military will say, do you want to survive or not? I think that's, unfortunately, this is a bit pessimistic, but I'm actually quite sure that, especially for critical infrastructure, privacy considerations will come completely at the bottom. And of course, it's all about economic power. Europe is learning that now the hard way, right? That it's not only about your policy and about negotiating. Sometimes you just go after your economy. And do you have enough control over your systems? Can you supply your own systems? Do you have your chips? Do you have supply chains? We're now learning this the hard way that, in fact, if you want to be independent and secure, you better also have your own supply chain or have a reliable partner providing your supply chain. So in cyber war, and this applies for the military, but also for the organized crime, attacking is much easier than defending. To get control over an iPhone, you just need to find one zero day. Just one flaw in one system, the way it processes PDFs, the way it checks certificates, the way it looks at movies. There is one flaw in there and voila, you have control. Well, if you're defending, you have to defend everything. And a modern device has between 20 and 100 million lines of code. And we know that for every 2 to 5 to 10,000 lines of code, there is a bug. And we know that I'm making this up, but probably 1 in 10 of those bugs are serious, which means they give you control over the device. And so you can look at the device and you can almost know how many critical bugs there are. And there is good statistics on this, but every year about 10,000 new bugs are being found. And of those, several thousand are serious. So that's the reality. So this means defense is very, very hard. You can't write secure code. There is one sector which writes more or less secure code, which is the airline sector. We don't see airplanes falling from the skies on a regular basis. In the beginning they did, and then they were fixed. Okay? So now, of course, airplanes have some software, but a line of software in an airplane costs, I don't know the exact numbers, but I guess 100 to 1,000 times more than a line of software on your iPhone. Okay, of course, you don't want to pay 20,000 euro for an iPhone, and every app costing 500 euro, you would stop using it very quickly. Most of us would, at least. Only the addicted would still pay for it. But you can't afford this, what you have on a plane. And in spite of all this security, you know, there was a few years ago, I think 2019, 20, I think it was 2019, there was an incident with United. So a hacker claimed that he could take the entertainment system in his seat and get control over the engines. And then the FBI came in, the guy was denied flying, and United said this is bullshit. But why was he denied flying then? He was talking bullshit, right? And so we never saw the end of this, but of course it's clear that planes are more secure, but I think all the experts think it's plausible that you would do this. From your seat, you can actually stop the engines. That in the most recent modern planes, maybe they fixed it now, but anyway, defending is very hard. You can do it remotely, right? So Ukraine says to volunteers, please go after the Russian systems. Nobody has to travel to Russia. You can from your home do this. By the way, don't do this because you actually, it's not because you sympathize with our Ukrainian people that it's illegal suddenly to do hacking from Belgium. Can be large scale. It's very hard to find out who is responsible because people look at the code, they look at the IP addresses, but of course the Russians can behave as if they're North Koreans, the Chinese can behave as if they're Russians imitating North Koreans. So in the end, it's very, very hard to find out who's attacking you. I think the only ones who really know is the Brits and the Americans because they have access to the backbone of the internet everywhere. And by the way, that's why they had Belgacom, because the British and Americans had no access between Asia and Africa because Belgacom was managing this. This is why they hacked it. But in general, they see all the traffic, which means in terms of attribution, they're probably the only ones who have a good guess who could do an attack. So what we see now is it goes beyond collecting data. Because if you're lip microphone is coming loose. This is only for the recording, but let's hope it works. Sorry. Small technical problem. Good, we can continue. So where was I? So yes, so we have spies. They always have existed, but they were there to look at troop movements, to find out information about political situation and so on. So spies have always existed. But then we had airplanes and satellites, but spies were always passive. Now, if people use digital systems, the spies now break in to get data. But once you're in a system, you can also change stuff. So in fact, the separation between I'm just collecting information or I'm just going to hack things, this is much more blurry. And this is also why the NSA's job was collect data to spy on everybody. And according to Snowden, they were very good at this. They collected everything they could. But now suddenly the NSA is hacking stuff. Because once you're in there anyway, you can as well hack it and take control. By the way, during Stuxnet, if you have the chance, you should watch the movie 0 Days. It's on YouTube. There was big panic in the Homeland Security Department in the US. And they're in charge of security of the electricity grid. And they were in panic because the NSA was hacking with a new attack electricity grid components, PLCs, in Iran. But Homeland Security didn't know who was behind it. So they were actually worried that the same attack would apply to their systems. They didn't know it was the NSA doing it. So there was big panic in Homeland Security that another nation state was actually attacking Iran and would use quickly those same tools against the US. So it gives you an idea about how much secrecy there is, and that even Homeland Security was caught by surprise that now the NSA is actually hacking stuff and destroying systems. And so I think what we now get at is, does deterrence work? So I think if you listen to what Biden has been saying, more or less, he told the Russians that if you attack our electricity system, we see this as a physical attack. And so I think in that sense, I'm pretty convinced that US, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and a few other players are capable of bringing down each other's electricity grid systems. And I mean not just a power outage for an hour, but maybe blow up the big transformer so that really you don't have anything for the next few months. But it's a bit like with nuclear power or nuclear weapons, it's mutually assured destruction. If you do it to us, we'll do it to you, so don't do it. So I think this is where we are now in terms of cyber war and the energy grid system. So the other problem is that, as I told you, I have somewhere a USB stick with Stuxnet on it. So once you use a tool, it spreads and everybody can have it. So also organized crime, I mean, like Petya and not Petya, organized crime has it too, and they can use it in their ransomware attacks. So it's once you use a tool, it's out there, and it's much harder to control than biological or chemical or nuclear weapons. Because as soon as you launch the attack, the target can look at what it is and can actually deploy it against yourself again. So it's much more risky in that respect. So here's a way to understand this better. So we have the military. I mean, we know what they do. They wage war. And of course, they have their own tactical intelligence. Maybe there used to be people with goggles, or today probably it's drones they use to see where the enemy is so they can decide where to shoot their rockets or their bombs. Then you have foreign intelligence. And part of it, like NSA, or in France, DGSE is part of the military, but like in Germany or UK, it's not part of the military. And the US, you have CIA is civilian and NSA is military. And so they fight with each other, they're competition for each other. Then you have national intelligence, so it's FBI, MI5, in France, DST, in Germany BVF. And then you have the private sector that also gets involved because they work for the other players to help them to develop tools and to manage stuff. So you get a very complex ecosystem where there is no clear boundaries who does what. And so this is what's happening. And so this very clear thing like this is airplanes and tanks and you can see them when they cross the border. Well, this is just very fuzzy. Sometimes it's military, sometimes it's not military. There is no concept of border. They're already there because they have spies. They have software in your systems. And what will they do? You'll find out. So of course, military is very different because military, they want to protect territory or they want to destroy stuff if they send to attack, right? They want to take control. Intelligence, they just want to find out what's happening. So they're more passive, absorbing. The legal basis, well, I'm not a lawyer, of course, and definitely not in this area, but there is rules for warfare and conventions. Now, for spies, there is only one rule. Don't get caught. That's the only rule. There is no legal regime for spies. If you get caught, tough, you may be executed or you may be banned to an island or whatever, but if you're caught as a spy, even your sending country will deny that you exist in many cases. Sometimes they're swapped and so on, but in general, rule number one, don't get caught. It's a very different legal regime. So how does it translate to cyberspace, where the boundary between military intelligence is fuzzy? So they have different ways of approaching, different targets as well. So spies can also go after economic targets in principle. Well, military, I guess they can go after critical infrastructure and combating entities, but not after civilians. And of course, the oversight is very different. But so the problem is that we had this clearly developed world of military intelligence, diplomacy, and the cyber world is now all blurring and it becomes very confusing. So in 2010, Ronald David warned for this and said cyberspace is militarizing. We have this fantastic internet, but it's becoming military battleground because there is not this something like a military internet, right? Of course, they have their own networks, but in the end, the military use the same networks as us because you can check it, the military can send you email, or you can visit their websites, at least their public websites. So they use the same internet, but they also work with intelligence agencies, they work with private contractors, and they work with these fuzzy non-state actors where like you don't know who they are. So 2 years later, Thomas Reid wrote a book, Cyber War Will Not Take Place. He gave a very tough definition of cyber war, what it was, but I think he was wrong because I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is clearly falls under his definition as far as I'm concerned. So I think you see that some people say it's not going to happen. Well, I'm afraid it is happening. So what some people say is that in cyber war, the best way to understand this, we go back to the 16th and 17th century, when nation states were trying to conquer the world, when Europe was a colonial power, but the powers were battling each other, and they were using in part pirates. So in fact, it's kind of, they were unregulated. Again, their rule was don't get caught, right? I mean, as pirate, if you got caught, that probably got all executed. But so it's a bit like this as well. So it's kind of unregulated armies that play a very central role, but officially they don't exist. And so it makes the world a more dangerous place. And with that difference, of course, that at that time, these pirates were sitting in the Caribbean or somewhere in front of somewhere in Asia, but now they're sitting in your smart meter. That's the difference. That makes the world an interesting place. So where are we going? Well, I think it's kind of obvious, and you'll hear about economics later, but I think if you want to do something on the smart grid, you should always have a business case, including a business case for securing things. Right? So you should show first money can be made, and then if you're smart, you make sure that enough of this money is assigned for security. And it's, I think 15% is a rule of thumb. It may be more because the smart grid is part of critical infrastructure. Maybe you should spend more on security there. This is just a dream. I don't think it's happening today. Today it's a few percent. But if you don't have a business case, there will be no money for the system, and there will also not be money for security. It's not that all these warnings have had no effect. So it's not that we are nowhere. There is actually a very complex mess of standards. And I'm not going to even try to explain you what exists. But it's clear, of course, that government has responded in the sense of creating standards. Some go for products, some go for governance, some cover technical aspects, some are more in detail, some are more operations. So there is IEC standards, there is IEEE standards, there is ISO standards on governance, there is ITF standards. So in brown is for the information systems, in green is for industrial automation, and in blue is specifically for power systems. So there is a lot. It's not that if you research this area, you have to start from scratch, right? There is, I think governments and the companies and the industry has understood that there is a problem, and that of course you have to set standards to be able to have an economic solution, because you can't invent everything at home. So that's the good news. Or the bad news is, if you're a researcher in this area, you better read those standards first, because you have to know what the baseline is and what is in there. It's not because there is standards they're any good. That's something else, right? They're very often a compromise. And they also were made in a different climate. So many of those standards were still made under the assumption that, yes, organized crime may try to hide their drug labs or their growing marijuana, that you steal some electricity. That was the main assumption. Or users may try to change their meter. I don't think that many of these standards were made with the mindset as China, Iran, and Russia are going to put malware in some microchip they produce in China, or have they will take over some software provider and actually put malware in the boot coder or the bootloader of your smart meter. I don't think that kind of threat model has arisen. So there is more. This slide was a European slide, so we didn't have the US standards. So Europe now has intervened with the NIS and NIS2 and IS2 directive. So they more or less, maybe Eleni will say more about this, but more or less they have defined what critical sectors are. And they've said, if you're in a critical sector, you have to have better security, which means you have to follow certain standards, you have to report incidents, and so on. So I think there is, in terms of intentions, it's very good. What I at least hear from practice is that it's probably not enough. And it's all very slow, the enforcement is slow, and it's like, if there is no secure devices to be bought, well, what are you going to do, right? You can take the best there is, and you can try to make your system as secure as possible, but I still think there is a very big gap between where we should be. There is a Cybersecurity Act, which is, on the one hand, it establishes ENISA for long term. ENISA is European Cybersecurity Agency. It gives them more funding, and it puts them in charge of coordination for certification. So somebody at the Commission believed in 2018 that the miracle answer to everything is certification. Certification, certification. Now, what do we know in security? That certification is very often a waste of time and box checking, and many certified systems actually have weaknesses and flaws, and if you patch the flaw, you lose your certification. So you have two choices. Either patch your system and become unsellable because it's no longer certified, or not patch your system and claim there is no problem. So it's still, the IT standards, of course, don't fit this environment. We discussed this in the beginning. It's a very different world. This focus on certification and regulation means that you shift to compliance. And GDPR had the same effect, which means that there is an army of managers, consultants, and lawyers coming down on your company. They produce long checklists, and then you hire people to check the boxes. But nothing happens. I'm a bit cynical now and a bit exaggerating, but that's where the companies put their money in. So if something happens, they can go to the DPA and waive the documents. We did everything, we checked everything, please don't punish it too much. Right? They're not saying we should take a step back, design secure systems, have a much better policy, invest more in security. No, they invest in the governance, management, and legal coverage, and the checkboxes. And every year they do the new checkboxes, but then you have all checkboxes, but you don't have security. And that's unfortunately how things are driven. Of course, the Russians and Iranians find this very funny, that you have checkboxes, because it will not protect you against them, because they don't follow the rules. So that's, I think, the problem. So we know that certification has failed, and so it may kill the business case. So time to wrap up. So there is also community efforts, like CSIRT, I mentioned ENISA, ESAC, reporting incidents, audits. So there is a lot of also non-technology, but community building, which is very important. The big problem there is, are you going to share information with the British? Because you know that GCHQ has been hacking Belgacom. Right? So everybody, oh, information sharing. But you know damn well that if you tell the British that there is a problem in one of your systems, they may tell GCHQ, who will then see whether they can break into this problem. So there is a lot of collaboration, but at a certain point only. Okay? So in terms of cyber war, there is a lot of efforts in governance, but in the interest of time I will skip that, but there is quite some efforts to define what is cyber war, to say when do you cross the border, when there is a problem. So there is at this moment a lot of informal documents and discussions and negotiations. It's still very fuzzy. But legal experts, international policy experts are trying to define what is a cyber attack. For example, Stoltenberg doesn't want to say what is a cyber attack that makes NATO respond with Article 5, for example. They still remain very fuzzy about this. Okay, so time to wrap up. So I think we have a very complex environment with a very high threat level. It's very difficult to protect against nation states who put an army of 1,000 hackers against you when your security budget is 1% of your total IT budget. Smart grid is critical. We need agreements that maybe to stop doing this, just like we have agreements on not having chemical weapons and biological weapons. Of course, you need to make systems more robust and more open. Maybe we should agree that this is not what is being attacked. It will be hard to come to agreement with Russia, but maybe with other nation states we can agree that we should not attack this, just like we don't attack certain other facilities. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy your lunch.